Hi there, and welcome to this presentation of my dissertation research project findings entitled Finding Meaning in a Changing World, Climate Anxiety and Existential Meaning. I've chosen this topic because climate and environment are at the heart of every person's experience of life and their place in the world. It therefore plays an important, albeit sometimes unseen, role in the therapy room. I've worked in international development and I've lived internationally. I've seen the effects of climate change. I've seen areas where access to water is limited or where there's no longer the grazing land available for herds. And I've seen the enormous impact that this can have on people's livelihoods and their well-being. Climate change is one of the biggest threats that we have faced. It's a truly existential threat, in fact. Recently, there's been a growing amount of research being done into climate anxiety, the phenomenon of an individual becoming anxious about the climate to the detriment of their health, their well-being and their functioning. It's a growing field, but there's still a lot to be done and a lot of areas to be explored. Some groups are more susceptible to climate anxiety than others, such as young people, indigenous people, and people closely involved with environmental work. The ability to derive meaning, whether from your work, your hobbies, your community, your relationships, or something else, is an important element of individual well-being. A systematic analysis of harm caused by climate change to intangible factors, which are non-material factors not relating directly to economic circumstance, found evidence of harm to mental and emotional well-being in all areas studied. I thought it would be interesting to directly compare climate anxiety and existential meaning, and to add a third variable, hopefulness. This is because hopefulness is an important mediating trait, which is important in many different ways to a person's well-being. I had two hypotheses. The first is that there is a significant correlation between existential meaning and climate anxiety, and between hopefulness and existential meaning. The second hypothesis was that the three variables would interact in a meaningful way, such that a multiple regression analysis could explain how two variables contribute to the third. I'll go into multiple regression in more detail later on. We obtained ethical approval for this study from Bangor University School of Psychology Ethics and Research Committee. The study used opportunity sampling. We recruited participants through social media and SONA, which is Bangor University's student participation system. The study used an online questionnaire investigating climate anxiety and existential meaning. The survey was available in both Welsh and English, since Bangor University is a bilingual university. The only inclusion criterion was that participants had to be over 18. This allowed us to look at the data from different demographic angles. It used a within groups design. Each participant was asked for demographic information and then asked to fill out several different questionnaires. There were three different co-variables. These variables were the Climate Anxiety Scale, designed by Clayton and Caracia in 2020, the Multidimensional Existential Meaning Scale, designed by George and Park in 2016, and the Adult Hope Scale, designed by Snyder et al. In 1991. A total of 426 people took the survey. However, after cleaning up the data and removing participants that didn't fully engage with the questionnaires or missed out several questions, we ended up with 380 participants. We then ran descriptive statistics, Pearson's correlation, and multiple regression analysis on this data. Regarding the whole sample, before we divided it later into demographic categories, we found there was a relatively low average of 25 for climate anxiety, of around 65 for existential meaning, and around 45 for hopefulness. As you can see, the majority of respondents scored relatively low on the climate anxiety scale. This tallies with earlier results. Both the original designers and later researchers validating the scale found fairly low scores on average. In fact, the designers of the scale themselves didn't expect the majority of people to score highly on it. This in turn means that even responses in the middle of the scale are higher than the average. We had more than 13% of respondents in the middle of the scale or higher, so this is clearly still a clinical issue that needs to be understood both more widely and in more depth in the broader mental health sector. On the existential meaning scale, on the other hand, there was a much more even distribution, focused around the middle of the scale. And with the adult hope scale, there was also a more even distribution, focused around the moderate to high end of the scale. I then carried out Pearson's correlation test. to look at the correlation between these different variables. We found a weak negative correlation between climate anxiety and existential meaning, and between climate anxiety and hopefulness. What this means is that as climate anxiety goes up, existential meaning and hopefulness both go down. Now, of course, this is just an average, so there will be outliers to this, but this is the general trend. These results were found to be statistically significant. Now, it's important to know that we don't know the direction of causality. I've found a weak negative correlation here, but I don't yet know whether high climate anxiety causes low existential meaning, or whether low existential meaning causes high climate anxiety. That simply isn't something that these results can tell us. There was also a very strong positive correlation between hopefulness and existential meaning, which is perhaps less surprising. Now, before I started this research, I had thought that the correlation between climate anxiety and existential meaning could go either way. A person with high climate anxiety might feel engaged in the fight to stop climate change and therefore have a high sense of meaning in their life. Or they might feel that the world is doomed and there's no point in doing anything, and therefore have a really low sense of existential meaning. But this research suggests that the latter is correct, that a person with high climate anxiety is more likely to have low existential meaning, and vice versa. But it is a weak correlation, and there were individual respondents who bucked this trend. So what makes that difference? Well, that's where multiple regression analysis comes in. It looks at how two variables interact to influence a third. In this case, I found that climate anxiety and hopefulness between them explained around 34% of the variance in existential meaning, with a large part of the contribution being made by hopefulness. This shows that hopefulness does help mediate it, so that a person with high climate anxiety and high existential meaning could also be expected to have high hopefulness. To put it another way, if a person has high climate anxiety, then whether or not they have high existential meaning will in large part be influenced by their sense of hopefulness. This suggests that it is a significant explanatory factor. I then divided the data into different demographic categories and carried out demographic analysis. By far the most interesting results came with nationality. There was strong variation between countries, as you can see here. Interestingly, countries which are experiencing the effects of climate change, such as Australia and Bangladesh, actually had lower climate anxiety than those whose experience of climate change has thus far been milder. This isn't in line with previous research, which has found more intense emotional responses to climate change from people who are directly affected by it, including indigenous peoples and farmers. There are various possible explanations for this. For one thing, we had very different sample sizes with regards to nationality. We had much larger groups of people taking the study based in the British Isles and the US and Russia than we did in either Australia or Bangladesh. So of course we would put much greater weight on the larger sample sizes. In addition, our study used an online survey. It's possible that participants were from professions or parts of their respective countries that weren't as strongly affected by climate change. It's likely that in an emergency situation, or even in very difficult situations, the internet's used for more immediately necessary tasks than filling out a postgraduate dissertation survey. Nonetheless, there were some really interesting variations among the different nationalities taking this survey, as you can see in this table. So were my hypotheses supported or not? Just as a reminder, the first hypothesis was that there is a significant correlation between climate anxiety and existential meaning, and between existential meaning and hopefulness. This hypothesis was supported. We found a weak negative correlation between climate anxiety and existential meaning, and a strong positive correlation between existential meaning and hopefulness. The second hypothesis was that the three variables would interact in a meaningful way, such that a multiple regression analysis could explain how two variables contribute to the third. This was also supported. The multiple regression analysis did find that the two variables of climate anxiety and hopefulness did help explain the third variable of existential meaning. So what are the implications for therapists of this research? Given the demographic differences in how people experience climate anxiety, it's important that therapists remain open to their clients' personal experiences of climate anxiety, and to how this may interact with their background, their past experiences, and their current circumstances. As climate change progresses, and the way that it affects people's mental health develops, therapists will need to continue to remain open to the changes in what people bring into the therapy room. Climate anxiety is still a relatively recent phenomenon, and we don't really know how it will change or manifest in the future. It's therefore important to continue training, research, and general learning around these issues. However, in spite of all of this, climate anxiety is only one part of a person's circumstances and experience. This research shows us some of the links between climate anxiety and existential meaning, and climate anxiety and hopefulness as well. And other studies have shown it has links to depression and to more general anxiety. This is a holistic issue, and we don't need to medicalise it. Feeling some worry about global issues that present an existential threat isn't necessarily of therapeutic concern. Only if this worry strongly affects quality of life does it become of therapeutic concern, and even then it may be that a general course of therapy to help the individual explore their feelings on their own terms would be most beneficial. In fact, other research has found that most practitioners don't want climate anxiety to be included as an official diagnosis in the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. This suggests that the field is not keen to medicalise climate anxiety. So what are the implications more widely for everybody? Well, to continue my previous point, there is a limit to what can be accomplished inside the therapy room by itself, and much of the work will need to be done in the client's own life. In fact, some research suggests that community solutions are at least as important as individual ones. Collaborative work in general, both inside the therapy room and in the individual's daily life, has been theorized to be most effective. A major finding of this research is the negative correlation between climate anxiety and existential meaning. It's therefore crucial for people struggling with climate anxiety to work on meaning making in their own life. These activities don't necessarily have to be related to climate change. Everyone has their own values and therefore different ways in which they derive meaning. In fact, these activities don't even have to be related to work. Some people find their work meaningful, but others derive meaning from community volunteering, or from their pastimes and hobbies, their relationships, or other aspects of their lives. But if a person is feeling particularly anxious about the climate, they may want to engage directly with climate change. This doesn't have to be activism, though both researchers and activists, notably Greta Thunberg, have found climate activism to be helpful in maintaining a sense of meaning in their own lives. Now, this research is only one small part of a much wider picture, and there is a great deal of further research that is needed into this really important topic. For example, what is the direction of causality between these variables? We know that there is a negative correlation between climate anxiety and existential meaning, but as I discussed earlier, does low existential meaning cause high climate anxiety, or does low climate anxiety improve an individual's sense of meaning? It would be really helpful to look more at the direction of causality here. For that matter, is it more important for an individual struggling with climate anxiety to work on hopefulness or on meaning making? Some of our international sample sizes were very small. Although other studies have been done internationally, there haven't been that many large-scale comparisons between this many countries, and it would be really helpful to have a study which did this with much larger international samples. It would also be really good to look at emergency situations. For studying an emergency context, field research might be more effective than an online survey if the resources allow for that. And finally, what are the most effective interventions for climate anxiety? Interestingly, both dream interpretation and group discussions have been found to be helpful in previous research, but there is a lot more research to be done. When the data is reduced to numbers, it can be really easy to lose sight of the individuals at the heart of this study, but it's important to keep in mind that as therapists we may find ourselves working with people whose very ability to enjoy themselves is negatively impacted by climate change. Within this study, there were people who stated that they're so affected by climate change that they have nightmares, they have difficulty sleeping, they find themselves crying or find their concerns affecting their ability to work or study. What kind of therapeutic interventions are most useful in this kind of situation? And of course, how can people who are struggling this much support themselves as well, work on improving their own sense of hopefulness, work on improving their own sense of meaning in their own lives, and reduce their anxiety about the climate? This is all research which still needs to be done. And finally, I'd just like to say thank you so much for your attention. Please do feel free to leave comments or questions below. You can also contact me at the email address on the slide if you would like to discuss this topic further. And finally, I'd just like to express my appreciation to the supervisors on this course for supporting me in this research, and to my group mates who carried out this research alongside me. Thanks very much for your attention.